is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair.
Ozymandias is one of the most famous poems of the Romantic era. It was written by Percy Shelley in 1817. The major theme behind Ozymandias is that all power is temporary. No matter how powerful, prideful, or tyrannical a ruler is, everything he does is temporary and will eventually decay. Or in Walter White's case, everything he does will horrifyingly collapse. In the Bible, the devil was banished from his high place in heaven down to the depths of hell. This was done due to his pride, which drove him to try and usurp God's position in heaven. Satan was dissatisfied and ego-driven. It wasn't enough for him to accept where he was and serve loyally and graciously. He wanted to be on top and was dissatisfied with anything less. He felt as though serving someone was below him, and because of this, he tries to drag all of creation down with him. Walter White's story arc is fundamentally about pride and ego, the first sin, an unquenchable vice. Every one of the 7 deadly sins gives you desires that can't be quenched, but pride is the most dangerous because it has to do with your authority in the universe. It renders you unable to recognize your faults because you see yourself as someone you fundamentally aren't. Walt is unable, or perhaps doesn't care about the fact that he's hurting everyone around him due to him seeing himself as someone who deserves everything. As Walt's past is sparingly and subtly revealed, it becomes clear that Walt's sin isn't born of a desperate desire to provide for his family. Walt has always been deeply yet secretly arrogant, so the moment his life is given a definite deadline, his pride begins to and successfully does devour everything around him, like the cancer he ironically suffers. Walt's choices wreck the lives of his family, his friends, his community, and even his city. Walt's evil is ugly, brutal. It destroys goodness and leaves despair in its wake. Ultimately, there was nothing good or dignified about it. In Season 4, Walt and Jesse find themselves at complete odds with each other due to Walt's continuously intensifying dispute with Gus. After a physical confrontation which leaves Walt hurt, he returns home, takes a bunch of painkillers, washes them down with a couple of beers, and sinks into reflective depression and delirium before he's visited by Walter Jr., who happens to be celebrating his 16th birthday. For his 16th birthday, he's gifted with the sight of his drunk, stoned father, bloodied and beaten up, mumbling and apologizing about God knows what, and crying his eyes out. Walter Jr. naturally can't leave his father alone in this state, so he stays over while he sleeps it off. The following day, Walt apologizes profusely for how much of a disgrace he was while strongly emphasizing one particular thing. Walter does not want his son to think of him as he was last night. Walter Jr. is confused, he doesn't really understand, and as a response, Walt explains how the death of his dad left an indelible mark on him. He speaks of how the only memory he has of him was in such a weak and pitiful state. This memory has left such a powerful mental imprint on him that it doesn't matter what anyone else says about him. He can't shake off this memory and thus his impression of his father. This helps explain Walt's psychology. Walt doesn't want to be seen by his family as someone like that, like a weak, docile man. He wants to go out in a blaze telling everyone that he was that guy. But Walt Jr. doesn't care about any of that. No one around him cares about any of that. They've all come to love the humble man they thought they knew. Walter is deathly afraid of he becoming the same thing he is to his children as his dad was to him. Of all the memories Walt could have had with his dad, this one stood out. Walter Jr. may have said that he wouldn't have minded him to be remembered this way, but Walt feels as though that wouldn't have been the case. To have their last memory of him being of a barely lucid, withering husk would destroy their ultimate perception of him.
Never give up control. Live life on your own terms. Every life comes with a death sentence. So every few months I come in here for my regular scan, knowing full well that one of these times, hell, maybe even today, I'm gonna hear some bad news. But until then, who's in charge? Me. That's how I live my life. Some dead man, some artificially alive
just marking time? No. And that's how you would remember me.
Despite Walt feeling this way about himself, feeling as though he'll be remembered as a coward and a loser, his family doesn't feel this way. They see him as a kind, loving family man. They just want their nice chemistry teacher who cares about his family. On some level, Walt knows this and he tries to keep up the facade. But man cannot truly compartmentalize himself. What he does in private eventually seeps into what is felt in public. I talk about that in my Jesse video with much more detail. Walt always believed himself to be worth greatness, but consistently slips into mediocrity. He never really felt fully appreciated for his capabilities, so once he gets a taste of it with the meth business, he can't turn back. We're introduced to Walt constantly being emasculated on his 50th birthday. During the party, he's told by Hank that the gun he's holding is too heavy because it's meant for real men. In the night, his wife gives him pity sex, and in the subsequent days, his disabled son calls him a pussy. I've heard people say that the main theme of the show is toxic masculinity, but I don't think that's Walt's greatest sin. What does him in is pride, the lust for power and control. This leads him to commit many other deadly sins, primarily greed and wrath. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis calls pride the great sin, for it is the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. This is why it's so easy for pride to spiral out of control. Because to get rid of pride, you would have to get rid of all of your other vices as well. Once Walt had the ability to feed into his pride, even just a little bit, it spirals out of control. And very quickly. And similarly quickly, the further Walt advances in his career, the more obstacles he has to overcome. The more he believes himself to be invincible, the deeper he descends into a hell of his making. When he tries to manage his crimes, he begets worse crimes. The more loose threads he has to tie, the more loose threads are created, until it all becomes too overwhelming and it explodes in his face. Walt enjoys feeling like a man by being on the top of the hierarchy and providing for his family, but the reason that becomes bad and detrimental to everyone's lives is because of his pride. It isn't enough to just make money. He has to do it his way and be the one whose name everyone knows. He doesn't just want a normal life, he wants an extraordinary life. To live with a little bit of adventure, as ironically Hank puts it. In his pursuit of achieving his own personal desires, he lost the more extrinsic sources of happiness, even though those are what mattered more. There was a small flashback where Walt says that the house he currently lives in is actually a starter house. Walter is clearly an overqualified chemistry teacher and is one of the founders of a multi-billion-dollar company. That small house was beneath him. Accepting pity money from people was also beneath him. This is why he refuses a sincere offer from the co-founders of a company that he helped start. Gretchen and Elliot offer to ameliorate the situation by paying for his cancer and giving him a job. But Walt refuses to go begging for their charity. He's offended by the very idea of relying on others for help and spurns the offer. Soon, Walt leverages his personal predicament to justify entering the meth business. All the factors that ostensibly led him to break bad could have disappeared. He could have worked for Gretchen and Elliot, but that wasn't how he wanted to make money. Similar to the devil himself, Walt was dissatisfied with serving someone else, and because of this, he drags his family down with him.
This guy, Gail Bedecker, he was eccentric. I mean, real character, you know. He's dead now.
Huh. Who was he?
He was a meth cook. He was a meth chef. I mean, we're talking 5 stars, candles, and white tablecloth, you know. I can't believe this word's gonna come out of my mouth, but he was a genius, plain and simple. I mean, boy, if he'd applied that big brain of his to something good, I don't know, who knows what could have helped humanity or something like that. I mean, how many actual geniuses are there in the world, right? If he'd kind of taken his life in a different direction, who knows?
Walt hated the fact that Elliot and Gretchen got rich from a company that he started. It haunted him for the rest of his life. In this scene, he basically reacts to trauma from the past. He's afraid that someone else might thrive from his ideas. Even if Gail is a dead man, he is not allowed to thrive from Walt's ideas. It isn't as much that Walt wanted to get credit for the work as it was Gale not getting credit for the work. He knew that getting his peers to recognize his genius would not have been optimal in this situation, so he settles for the next best thing by making sure that they don't think that Gale is the best, to make sure his peers at least don't think that Gale is better than he is. It isn't that Walt wants to be seen as one of the best among many, it's that he wants to make sure that he is unmistakably, undeniably the best. Breaking Bad is unique because Walt's sins aren't a product of his nature or upbringing or social environment, it's a product of his own consciousness. In a Rolling Stone interview, Gilligan explains Walt's cancer means that he is now awake. He's awakened from sleepwalking for the past 5 decades of his life. The sudden lack of constraint and inhibition allows him to be the person he truly is. Unfortunately, the person he truly is, most definitely is not all good. Walt's sinful nature lay dormant before being awakened by circumstance. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis offers an illuminating metaphor. He explains that what a man does when he is taken off guard is the best evidence of the sort of man he is. This is what pops up before the man has time to put on the disguise of virtue. If there are rats in a cellar, you're most likely to see them if you go in very suddenly. But the suddenness does not create the rats, it only prevents them from hiding. In the same way, the suddenness of the provocation does not make an ill-tempered man, it only shows them what an ill-tempered man they are. This is why I somewhat have an issue with the question of when Walter White died and Heisenberg began. It implies that Walter White, at some point, became a shimmering evanescent entity as Heisenberg began to take over. But I don't believe that Walter White and Heisenberg are two wholly distinct entities. Heisenberg is merely the reaction to his death sentence. I hear Walter White and Light Yagami from Death Note being compared to somewhat frequently, and I generally agree with the comparisons. The chief difference in my estimation is that the Death Note actually changed Light, but I believe Heisenberg was always there. At the very least, I believe he's been there since his father died. Breaking Bad is not a story of a good person gone wrong. We see nothing of Walt's character that indicates that he's some kind of exemplar of virtue. Rather, Breaking Bad is a story about how the opportunity for evil can rise up and take over. How a man can choose evil once and must keep choosing evil as a form of moral inertia. In terms of his ultimate destination, the earlier decisions were just as harmful as the later ones. Walt's pride at the dinner table is just as important as his murder, his lying just as corruptive as his violence. After the plane crash, which cascaded from him allowing Jane to die, Walter finds the plastic eyeball of a teddy bear that fell into the pool and keeps it in his pocket. Like one of those small trinkets of trash that you forget to throw away, the eyeball continues to haunt him, peeking out from under the bed, peering into his life. The eye serves as an omnipresent reminder of not only Walt's transgressions, but also the devastating consequences that he will not escape, as if some kind of god was watching him and ready to punish him.
Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
Those consequences are reaped in full in one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen in the episode Ozymandias. In this episode, everything in Walt's life that he's been building up to since episode 1 comes crumbling down in a horrifying crescendo. Walter Jr. finds out about Walt and ends up hating him, he gets into an explosive fight with his family, he loses most of his money, and Hank dies. In Granite State, the next episode, we see the fallout of the event with him being alone and helpless. And in the finale of the show, Felina, we get a sort of sanctification for Walt. He isn't forgiven for anything he does, but he does end up atoning for some of his sins. He gets money for Walter Jr., he gets revenge for Hank, he frees Jesse, and he gives Skyler the coordinates to find Hank. In this scene, Walter also tells Skyler that he actually did it for himself. As he's saying this, I think he's realizing now for the first time why he's doing it. I don't think he fully realized why he was doing it until he said it. You can see it in his face that he is genuinely only now realizing this for himself. That everything he did wasn't actually for his family. If it was, they wouldn't be crying there to him. They wouldn't be defending themselves from him. They wouldn't be emotionally scarred for life. He did it because he was good at it, because he wanted power, because he wanted to feel alive for the first time.
I did it for me. I liked it. I was alive.
Walt's desires aren't necessarily wrong. Wanting to provide for your family, wanting to reach the top of your craft, wanting to live an adventurous life, these desires aren't wrong. They were just tainted with pride. You really have to commend Bryan Cranston and Anna Gunn for this performance. The performances are truly spellbinding. This moment of Walt finally admitting that he did it for himself was such a relief not only for Skylar, but for the viewers. We all knew it, but hearing him finally say it was so satisfying. This is my favorite scene of the show. Thank you for watching.